perhaps.
Well, Pam, do you want to get us started?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you, Eleanor, for climbing the mountain of Zoom to be with us today. I want to, first of all, if anyone hasn't purchased the book yet and is interested, there's a 20% discount code. Allison is going to try to put the link in the chat, but if not, then you go to Temple University Press, and the discount code is the letter T, the number 20, and the letter P for Peter. So T for Temple, the number 20, and then P for Peter. And we also wanted to give credit to Jonas Lundstrom, the disabled artist who gave us our beautiful book cover. That's also my background here today. And I just want to briefly say, you know, we came to this idea to write this book together because we're all social movement theorists, and we have looked at disability activist groups that are run by parents and also disabled people, and have noticed some differences and tensions. And it's not something that really had been discussed in the scholarly literature, not in sociology, where Richard and Allison are based, and not in anthropology, where I'm based, or even just more generally in disability studies. So, you know, we're really interested in thinking about the sort of disability histories involved, and how parents were central to organizing supports and services through creating different movements, but also sometimes in alliance with and sometimes at odds with disability activist groups and movements that are led by disabled people. So the book has both chapters that are case studies looking at particular disability histories for particular groups of disabled people. And then we also have chapters that are on cross-cutting themes. Today we're focusing more on the cross-cutting themes. Richard will talk about historical roots and different styles of activism. Allison's going to talk about adherence and deviation from key tenets of disability activism within parent-led organizations versus organizations led by disabled people. And then I'm going to talk about the roles and perspectives of parent activists and how those roles and perspectives might change across the lifespans of both the parents and the children as everyone moves through time. And then Allison's going to conclude with what we hope are the takeaways or lessons learned, and we'll open it up for Q&A. Stop it. And my dog feels like she's participating too. Excuse that. So I'm going to pass the mic, so to speak, over to Richard now.
Hi, thanks, Pam. I'm Richard Scotch. I'm a sociologist, and I became very interested in this as I was writing a number of organizational histories for the Encyclopedia of American Disability History, and I discovered that there really hadn't been a lot written about this, and developed some shared interest with Allison and Pam, and became interested in a lot of these parent organizations really became active in the period immediately after World War II. And so some of what I've written in the chapters I contributed to focuses on some of those larger contexts. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes. The historians in the meeting aren't going to be surprised by anything they hear from me. But one of the themes is that after World War II, after the war, after the Depression, the United States became much more affluent. Not everyone, of course. But as part of that affluence, there was a rising aspirations for parents about their children and about themselves. And that also was a period, as we all know, when women, after having been active in the workforce during World War II, were more or less pushed home, and there became a kind of popular culture celebration of domesticity and of parenting. And so this very sort of self-conscious, I'm a parent, I need to do the best for my children, kind of collided with what was happening to a lot of families that had children with disabilities. Whereas previously they had been encouraged to send their children to institutions, they began to think more about how they might do this at home, how they could maintain their families and make their children more part of the communities in which they lived. And this was also a period when there was a critique of institutions generally. Some of that came out of World War II and the work that Stephen Taylor has documented on conscientious objectors who drew attention to the terrible conditions in these facilities. Some of this was just an awareness in both in popular culture and in public policy circles about the abuses and the limitations of these institutions. This was also a period when education became increasingly considered to be important within American society. And so allowing or forcing or enabling one's children to get a good education, to go to school, became more important. Many children with disabilities were not allowed to go to schools. And yet in the context of the Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement, other areas, it became recognized that education was more important. This was also a period with a rise in consumerism when people were less willing to accept professional expertise about what was good for their children. The doctrines that you would be better off turning your children over to experts, perhaps in these incarceral institutions, became rejected by parents. It was the era of Dr. Spock when parents were encouraged to do things on their own and to follow their own instincts. And that was a time when parents wanted to keep their children in their homes and give them access to the things that other children, the resources, the opportunities that other children had. Of course, it was also a time of activism. So the Black Civil Rights Movement was flourishing. And as we go a little later into the 60s, the Disability Rights Movement was becoming more and more visible. And so all of these tended to push or enable parents to become more involved in the lives of their children and to try to make sure that their children had as many opportunities as they could. And so this led to a lot of activism in terms of exercising social capital by using networks to gain advantages for people's children. Some of the early activists were influential people in their communities, kind of wielding their white privilege to get schools to open themselves up, because many of the early activists, at least, were white Americans. But they're also engaged in a lot of grassroots organizing in which they try to identify and join forces with other parents who had children with similar kinds of situations and trying to work together to force local schools to accept their children, to force communities to provide more opportunities for their children, and to force public policies to guarantee more opportunities for their children. And so that kind of wielding of informal influence and power became also tied to more contentious kinds of political activities. And so there was lobbying, there was lobbying at the local level, then at the state level, and ultimately, particularly by groups like the ARC, particularly in places like Pennsylvania, there were lawsuits. There were lawsuits that challenged some of the laws that allowed children with disabilities to be excluded. There were lawsuits that challenged how institutions didn't really take care of the children who were committed to them. And there were lawsuits that tried to provide guarantees of due process and of equal protection just as the civil rights movement did for African American children, to provide some of those same protections for children with disabilities. And so as we segue into the 1960s, we see that not only were there sort of conventional politics, not only was there legal advocacy, but there also was increasingly protests. And here the parents kind of learned from the self-advocates, from people in the disability community who were adopting some of the rhetoric and some of the tactics from the Black civil rights movement and from other movements of the time, the women's movement, student movements, to challenge the exclusion and the oppression of children with disabilities. And so all of these things combine to develop into a fairly cohesive, but also a very widespread and diverse parents movement. So I'm going to turn this over to Allison now, but I'll be glad to answer questions later if you have any. Thank you.
If I could just interject something. This is Eleanor Block. I'm a sociologist too. But as I was telling Pamela and Susan, I got tenure in 1985, and then my disabled son was born in 1988, and the doctor said that he would never read or write or speak. So I gave up my tenured position and I stayed home with him. And but I'm still a sociologist, even though I haven't taught for many years. Just thought I'd interject that.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly through history, your experience is sadly one of, that was common for parents to be told that their kids wouldn't amount to anything, and that there were no other choices.
Right.
Where parents couldn't have kind of their own careers and take care of their kids because there were no community services available. So Richard has brought us to a point in history where the parent movement is full-blown, and we also see organizations led by people with disabilities, and at times they joined together to pursue common causes, and when they did, it was really powerful, right? So the right to education, funding for community services, the Americans with Disabilities Act, these are times when parents and organizations led by people with disabilities collaborated to really important results. But we also see at times sharp divisions emerge and even antagonism between organizations that are led by people with disabilities and parent activists. And so we wanted to explore, right, the name of the book is Allies and Obstacles. We wanted to explore this complicated dynamic that emerges over time. So in the book, we look at this dynamic in a couple different ways. We look in different disability communities. We look at a variety of policy issues. And one of the things that we did, which will be my focus here, is that we looked at the politics of specific parent groups and groups led by people with disabilities to really see where do they build alliances, when do they build alliances, and when does that fall apart? So let me start by just saying a little more about the organizations run by people with disabilities. We usually see the heart of disability activism as these grassroots organizations that are run by activists with disabilities. And these include organizations, and I'm not going to list them all, there's a lot of them, like ADAPT, and the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and the National Association of the Deaf, the National Federation of the Blind, Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered. These organizations are diverse, but they've built a stable coalition on the basis of shared interests, including social reform to achieve full rights and accessibility, inclusion, and the empowerment of people with disabilities. Parents and parent-led disability organizations may or may not fully embrace the same goals as organizations led by people with disabilities. So we identify 3 key areas of possible alliance, but also of division, and I'll walk you through those areas. The first area is social reform, and here I'm going to cautiously say versus medical treatment. In general, organizations led by people with disabilities advocate for social reform, for society to become increasingly accessible, for the provision of rights and supports necessary for people to participate in society. Now, this doesn't have to come at the exclusion of medical treatment, but usually the priority is not so much funding medical research or finding a cure, but rather the desire to enable all people across a full spectrum of human differences to exercise rights and feel valued. Some parent groups also focus on fighting for this kind of social reform and for rights. So the National Organization of Parents of Blind Children, for instance. This group does not dedicate a lot of its resources to medical research or the quest for a cure, but rather it delivers information to parents about issues of equality and access. They teach parents how to build their children's blind skills, like Braille and mobility training. They connect parents with blind adults who can serve as mentors, and their policy positions demand accessibility and inclusion. As such, they can really easily ally with activists with disabilities. Autism Speaks, on the other hand, is one of the parent-led organizations most likely to use a medical approach. They often refer to autism in medicalized terms, and often negative medicalized terms, such as the epidemic of autism. They have compared autism to cancer. Much of their fundraising goes to medical research for a cure. Their primary goal is cure and to minimize the effects or appearance of autism, right? Not to demand social reforms or civil rights. So autistic activists argue that this medicalized approach actually increases the stigma of autism rather than decreases it. They find themselves frequently at odds with Autism Speaks, and they very rarely collaborate on legislation. We don't see a lot of alliance there. So to move to a second area, we can look at the degree to which organizations fight for an inclusive and integrated society versus fighting for specialized or segregated services. So most disabled activists fight vehemently to create the infrastructure and rights needed to ensure that people with disabilities are able to live valued lives in the community. They fight against large-scale institutionalization. They fight against large disability-specific service settings that they feel function primarily to warehouse people with disabilities, such as large day centers and sheltered workshops. Parent groups are more likely, though, to support these specialized services. So here we can look at debates around sheltered workshops. Sheltered workshops are places where people with disabilities work, often for less than minimum wage, with the support and supervision of paid staff. These were once seen as a cutting-edge alternative to long-term institutionalization. But disabled activists argue that now sheltered workshops are pretty outdated. They're highly segregated. They tend to keep people with disabilities in poverty, and they rarely lead to community employment. So organizations led by people with disabilities have advocated for the closure of sheltered workshops and putting money instead into community-based employment. Parents, though, may opt for a range of specialized, parents in general want a range of services, including the opportunity to use, if they want, more specialized, more segregated services like sheltered workshops, because they meet certain needs. So sheltered workshops tend to be relatively stable. They're run by professionals. They tend to welcome parent input. Community-based jobs, on the other hand, pose a lot of risk from a parent perspective. Community employers hire and fire at will. They may only offer people a couple hours of work per week. Shifts change at a drop of a hat. Employers do not want to deal with parents typically. So the move to community employment may seem really problematic for parents, and it may create a lot of work for them. So while parents with disabilities argue that they have a right to employment in the community, some parents have fought to maintain sheltered workshops. We see this, I'll use an example of a particular parent-led organization, which Richard mentioned, the ARC. The ARC primarily serves people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And on the one hand, they have been on the forefront of disability rights activism. They fight alongside disability activists for policies that support inclusion. They have a great position statement asserting the right of people with disabilities to participate in all realms of community life. And they've increased their services to support employment in the community. But they are also one of the primary providers of large sheltered workshops. Their primary constituency is parents, many of whom want sheltered workshops, and when the ARC has moved towards closure, their members have often revolted. Sheltered workshops are also a key part of the ARC's revenue stream, infusing stable state funding into their organization for the provision of basically full-time services. So although national organizations of people with disabilities have called for the closure of sheltered workshops, the ARC's been more hesitant to move in that direction. The third area that shapes alliance or division is empowerment. People with disabilities want to exert control over the policies and services that supposedly serve them. But parent-led organizations tend to be just that, parent-led. So some parents join organizations led by people with disabilities, but most parents join with other parents in their activism. And parent-led organizations tend to maintain parent control. Some, though, offer leadership and input by people with disabilities, and this fosters alliance. So the National Alliance on Mental Illness, for example, NAMI, a majority of their board are family members, parents and siblings. But 31% of their board of directors are people with or who have had psychiatric diagnoses. They also have a council for self-advocates. So they have ways for people with disabilities to share their perspective and their voice. It's always a minority position, so it's unclear whether people with disabilities can really challenge a parent perspective, but at least the perspective of people with disabilities are there. Some other parent groups have almost no representation on their board, no councils. So VOR is an organization that is known for supporting the maintenance of institutions and these large disability-specific settings like large day centers and sheltered workshops. VOR reports no self-advocates at all on their board. Autism Speaks reports 2 of 29 members have disabilities. So Autism Speaks very purposefully in their board of directors reaches out to, they have directors who make connections to media companies, to medical centers, to large corporate donors, but they haven't built connections to national self-advocacy groups of people with autism, right? So it may not be surprising that these are some of the organizations least likely to ally with disabled activists. So parent activism is diverse, and some groups are more likely to ally with disabled activists than others. And in my last few minutes, I just want to share our argument that parent organizations, though, do tend to share 2 key beliefs: relationality and parent authority. And these can both serve as a point of alliance, but they can also create tensions. The first idea, relationality, means that parents see the rights of disabled people and the rights of parents as deeply intertwined. For example, the right to an education is not just the right for a person with a disability, it's a right for the parent. It enables the parent to go to work. So when education goes away, as we're seeing right now during pandemic, this has a potentially devastating effect on the child, but also on the parent. The relational perspective is an important basis for alliance because parents see shared interests. They're fighting for their own children and they're fighting for themselves. But in the relational model, rights aren't absolutes. The family has multiple members, each has competing needs. Not everyone can always get their rights. Rights are not the sole or even the primary rationale of families. So parents may choose a sheltered workshop because they believe it is really the best opportunity for their offspring, or they may choose it because it offers full-day programming and transportation and the parent needs those features, right? Even if the person with the disability wants or has a right to something else, parents see these options as a legitimate weighing of competing needs. The second fundamental belief is parent authority. It's been really important for parents to establish themselves as experts and be recognized as authority. When parents aren't recognized as authority and somebody else has authority, like the state, really bad things can happen, like institutionalization. But the same claim to authority can be really problematic. When rights are negotiated in the family, parents tend to retain more authority to make decisions. In the political realm, parent organizations carry more money, more political weight than organizations by people with disabilities. So let me wrap up here. Parent organizations tend to value parent rights alongside the rights of people with disabilities, and they stress parent authority. And that means that on the one hand, parent organizations are one of the best allies people with disabilities can have because it matters to them. Parents are invested. On the other hand, the priority on parent rights and parent authority makes that relationship really tenuous, even as we move into the future. All right, now I'm going to shift over to Pam, and we will take questions and answers after. I'll do a quick wrap up once Pam is done, and then we'll take questions and answers.
Thank you, Allison. So I'm going to be talking about issues across the lifespan and how relationships of parents to political organizing might change over time across their lifespan and their children's lifespan. And I'm going to hit on 5 major themes, sort of going, again, sort of linear and sort of semi-linear way across the lifespan. So thinking about the parents of babies who are newly diagnosed, newborns sometimes, or newly diagnosed, as I think it was Allison talked about earlier, the focus is often on a biomedical approach where cure and treatment advocacy is at the forefront, right? And there are sometimes clashes between parents and parent groups and groups led by disabled people over the right kinds of what each group considers to be the essential, the life-saving, the life-changing types of interventions that are needed. And so no matter what the parent chooses to do, they're already in a space of failure, because if they go one way, then they've failed to go the other way. And, they're being told that is going to ruin their child's life, right? And we see this across many different disability experiences, different diagnosis groups. And so it's a very stressful time. And it's also a clash of authority. Like, parents really feel like they know what is best for their kids, what their kids need in the very contextualized situation of their lives, the family life. And then disabled people who were once disabled children have very strong opinions about what is appropriate, that a child should be learning sign language from the very beginning, or a child should not be getting applied behavioral analysis if they're autistic, for example. And so the stakes are very high, and this is a very high stress time for parents. And then moving to the next stage, this is something that Richard talked about, and that was educational advocacy. And Allison talked about aspects of this as well. So because they covered it so well, I'm going to focus on those periods of transitioning into school and advocating for the types of services that that parents feel are needed, and also transitions between different levels of schooling and transition from school to post-school life, which might mean vocational or more like higher education or entering the workplace, or it might mean entering a sheltered workshop, or it might mean that you've timed out, your services are, you've turned 21 and under IDEA, at least in the United States, you are now, no longer have the funding or supports to go out into the community at all, and you're stuck at home. And so these lead to transitions of relational transitions, right? That might be a moment when parents are no longer able to work. Eleanor was talking about how when her child was first born was when she stepped out of the workplace, but it can also happen at that transition to adulthood is another possible area. And then we also see a lot of tensions, again, between parent groups or parent approaches and disabled activist approaches in terms of when and how parents should let go of certain kinds of control over their children. Now, there was a movement and a court case in the United States in recent years called Justice for Jenny, and that was Jenny had been riding her bike to work, had a community-based living situation, a community-based work situation. She was hit while she was on her bike. Her parents got scared, and they ended up, for technical reasons, while she was in the hospital, assumed guardianship, but then they didn't relinquish it, and they forced her against her will into a group home, where she did not want to be, and cut off her contact with her former friends, her former neighbor, community-based support network. And there was a court case which established that, in fact, she did have a right to make these choices. And even if the parents were guardians, they, had exceeded their authority and needed to let go. And in fact, I think she was able to become her own guardian. So the next thing I want to talk about is communication access or lack of access. And so I'm thinking in this section, we discuss how the importance of access to different kinds of assessments and different kinds of technologies that, if they're available, they make a huge difference in people's quality of life. If a person has a communication strategy in place, even if it's just a simple yes and no, that opens up worlds of opportunity that are not available if no communication strategy is in place. And sort of access to these kinds of technologies and these kinds of communication methodologies and approaches it's very stratified. It depends on where you live, and there are racial and class-based disparities that can make a huge difference in quality of life all along the lifespan, right? And disabled activists, really focus on this idea of presuming competence, because if you don't have a communication strategy, then it oftentimes you're presumed to be incompetent. And again, that makes a huge difference in how you experience the world and the kinds of options that are available or not available to you. And again, the risks and the costs are high for parents because they're judged either way. They're judged for trying experimental technologies or questionable methods, but then they're also feeling like they're failing their children if they don't try absolutely everything. So this is a very stressful, but a very important nexus point across many disability experiences and diagnoses and conditions. So the next thing I want to talk about just very briefly is sexuality and sexual rights and sexual access, which is something that typically in community life, as you grow into adulthood, you have opportunities and access and, the ability to express yourself sexually and engage in sexual intimacy or romantic intimacy. This is not guaranteed for disabled people. And in fact, In some cases, it's in some both structural organizational cases, like if someone's going to a sheltered workshop or a school, sometimes they're called schools even though it's supporting adults. People say, well, this is a workplace. It's not appropriate for you to engage in romance or sexual activity. And then when you're at home, you know, with your parents there, that's not a comfortable place either. And so you're left with no spaces in your life where you have the opportunity. And there, of course, there's also financial constraints as well. And then there are also cultural perceptions about sexuality of disabled people as either being asexual or hypersexual. And these can have, again, profound consequences. The notion, the perception of disabled people of certain diagnoses as being sexually dangerous, of course, you know, really is reinforced in American culture and American literature and in film. It encourages a fear of disabled people, and at the same time, it's a myth, obviously, but it also hides realities of experiences of abuse that disabled people face. That the reality is people are more likely to experience abuse than to perpetrate abuse, far more likely, right? The statistics, especially if people are institutionalized, they have an almost 100% chance of experiencing physical and sexual violence. So, you know, the contrast between the perceptions of people being sexually dangerous versus the realities of people being preyed upon, and you know, even if, and in between those extremes, you know, just not even having the opportunity or access to, you know, to expressing sexuality, it's a very complicated and difficult situation. Now, the final piece that I want to talk about is aging and interdependence that might, and different kinds of conflicts that might develop as parents age and as children age, as parents might be aging into disability, right? Who may not be able to, as they're losing mobility, or if they might be losing mobility or the ability to engage in certain kinds of physical supports that they were able to provide in earlier periods of their children's lives. Parents may have other kinds of increased mobility if they are retired and they may want to move. And if, you know, and then they have to make choices. Do they stay geographically close to their child if the child is living outside of the home? Do they move with the child if the child is moving in the home and sort of ripping the roots and the community-based connections that their child might have? Or do they themselves, you know, not move, remain and, you know, lose the, you know, just not take the opportunity to move or change their settings as they retire? And support needs change, as I said, and finances change. So, and then as parents may pass away, the kinds of things that happen in children's lives, like quality of life of the surviving child, might change. In some cases, the quality of life may decline, and in some cases it may improve. If someone lived a very sheltered, controlled life where they had very little choice, and then were able to move on to a situation where they had more choice and more access and more abilities to engage in activities of their choice, then, you know, that might actually be a positive thing. So I think, you know, it's really important to think about aging in relation, as parents and children, you know, move through life as a kind of interdependence where we might even see disabled people becoming the caregivers of aging parents, for example. And I also actually want to not forget that we also have parents who are disabled themselves, who might also have disabled children, but are also themselves have disability experience. And so I'm going to cut myself off here and let Allison wrap us up, and then we'll be able to have our question and answer session.
All right, thanks, Pam. I think one of the things that's really important about Pam's section is this idea that activism is a lifelong endeavor, and parents constantly have to be building new skills, right? There's always new issues, new problems, new bureaucracies to deal with. We want to get to the question and answer, so I'm going to keep this wrap up super short with just a couple quick implications. We would love to encourage parent activists to seek out organizations led by people with disabilities, to hear those perspectives, to understand those perspectives, and consider supporting those groups, building the alliances. We also encourage activists with disabilities to build structural channels to engage parents. So the National Federation of the Blind offers a really nice example of an organization that has a subunit for parents, right, and gives them tools and helps build those alliances. Mostly, we hope to have a conversation about how to best meet the needs of people with disabilities and their family members. Not one group instead of the other, but groups in solidarity working to meet the range of human needs. And so we hope our book is a contribution towards that conversation. We'd like to open it up for questions. Discussion.
People can ask them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or you can jump in. Well, I'll start with one. I'm the parent of an adult son, and he's 37 now, and I have noticed all throughout his life a distinct difference between mothers and of disabled sons and mothers of disabled daughters. And that a lot of what I advocate for my son, it seems like mothers are I don't know, a generation behind me, you know, that what I think is best for my son in terms of his independence and participation in the community, I can't find mothers of disabled daughters in the same boat. Is that something you've encountered in your research, or is that, am I isolated in discovering that?
Pam, do you want to take that? Should I take that?
Actually, I hadn't really thought about it that way before. I'm not sure I'm willing to draw that line. It could be true. And yet, my own experience in my family with my my sister and my mother is that you know, I didn't see that distinction. I actually had more experiences of where, and maybe it was generational differences. I've seen mothers of men and boys who were extremely repressive, and mothers of daughters who were very empowering. So yeah, so I'm not sure if other people have something to interject. That would be great, but it's not something that I've seen in a sort of a collective sense.
Yeah. Well, my son is at camp today, and I was asking him, who have you met? Who do you like? You know, who have you been hanging out with? And he says, I really like Connie. And I said, oh, okay. And I asked him some more questions, and I said, would you like to ask Connie out for a date? And he says, no, because her mother won't let her date. And this is not the first time. I would say this is probably the third or fourth time in the last 2 or 3 years that has been what has happened, is the daughters are not allowed to date, and they're in their 30s.
May I interject for a moment on this topic?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my name is Tamara Bigel. I am in my 40s, and I have experienced disability from myself as an individual with a disability, starting early on with dyslexia, but now I'm hard of hearing as well. I also have a son with a disability, and I served as a case manager and advocate both for agencies and parents. One of my positions was as a case manager in group homes for children, or for adults with disabilities. And what I found, I had houses of boys in the beginning, and then I had houses of girls, just because I had changed administrators. And what I found with that particular age group was that parents were more willing to let their boys go out and date. And when we broached, I worked in Chicago, and they were quite progressive there. So back in the 90s, early 2000, that we had a sexuality consent form that we filled out for each client, determining whether they were capable of making decisions, and most of them were, according to the consent form. And then we worked with parents to help them adjust to the concept that their kids would go out and date. And I see the same things that you're bringing up, Susan, that it took a lot for us to convince the girls' parents that should be a natural part of life that they get to enjoy, and that we can work with our ladies and gentlemen to be respectful, but also know the things they need to know when it comes to dating. I don't know if that's changed. I left that job when I became disabled with another medical condition, but at least in the 90s and 2000s, that's what I saw. I don't know if there's been a shift as women are taking a different role, and you consider, but I think it has a lot to do with parents.
Yeah, and I think the research does still show a double standard. For us, we didn't so much look at the gender of the children in making those kinds of decisions, but when we look at parent activism broadly, we do see that parents are much more likely to lend their political weight behind getting community services, access to education, and sexuality in general is not on the top of parents' lists in terms of thinking about how do we support people in being sexual, how do we get kids access to appropriate sexual education, how do we give them support so that they can date, right? And so where parents are putting their activism energy, sexuality certainly is not typically on the top of their agenda, whereas again, for people with disabilities, it is often a very important policy agenda.
This is Laura Frankel. I just wanted to interject that there are questions in the chat that you might want to check.
Oh, thank you.
And earlier, Nan had her hand raised, so.
Yep. All right. Well, let's go to Nan, and then we'll read off some of these questions from the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura, for bringing me in. I just wanted to share, as we've been talking about gender differences in the way disability plays out in the lives of parents and disabled children. I just wanted to share that my father was legally blind, and he had a very rare form of vision loss that rides on the X chromosome. And what it means is I inherited an X chromosome from my father, and that makes me a carrier of his condition, of his low vision condition. It is a condition that only men get. Women are carriers. The daughters of these men become carriers and have a 50% chance of passing it on to their sons. And so my sister and I inherited this X-linked gene that produces blue cone monochromacy, which is a congenital malformation of the retina. And it leaves the person legally blind and also colorblind, vision worse than 2200. So her 3 grandchildren who inherited this gene and are legally blind are all boys. So blue clone monochromacy is a disease that goes active only in male children who inherit the gene. So it'll be interesting as I watch my 3 grandnephews grow up to see how it affects their chances of dating and marriage, as well as their ability to complete college and get good jobs. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
8 o'clock. I want to let Matthew, our interpreter, go. Thank you very much for being a part of this. And if anyone feels the need to go because they only committed an hour, that's understood. But you are welcome to stay on. We don't have a time limit. So stay with us if you still want to share.
Thanks.
I'll say goodbye to everyone. I have to leave.
Thank you, Phil.
Bye.
Let me read one of the questions from the chat.
Yeah, do you want me to read it, or do you want? How do research institutions help or hinder movements for disability justice? What are examples of research institutions that embody collaboration with and leadership by disabled leaders?
I think, and Richard would be well poised, I think, to answer this, but some of the institutes on disabilities, the University Center for Excellence, some of those take very strong policy roles. So I worked at the Institute on Disabilities, and it was very geared towards thinking about how to empower people with disabilities. They made a point to make sure that there were people with disabilities in leadership positions, and they run a program that actively works with self-advocacy organizations and that trains parents. So I think, so the Centers for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, those are funded, they began in the Kennedy era, and they're funded by the federal government, and so they're one example of that.
I can, there's another example, which is the ADA National Network. I think a couple of people on the call are familiar with this, but the federal government funds 10 regional centers to provide technical assistance and support both to organizations that want to become more accessible because of the ADA, but also to a number of groups of people with disabilities to try to give them skills, organizational skills, to become more effective advocates. And most of these centers, although not all of them, are housed at universities. So I'm here in Texas. There's a university in the Houston area led by Lex Friedan, who is one of the authors of the ADA, and they're very influential. There's similar organizations in Seattle and other parts of the country. Syracuse has an important role. So I think the point here, one point that could be made about this is universities these days don't have the capacity to do much unless they receive some kind of external funding. And so for universities to partner with communities, there needs to be some resources that will allow them to do that. Now, another way that universities become active is through the development of disability studies programs. And that's a little less driven by dollars and more driven by student interests and faculty interests. So a number of universities, including Allison's and places that Pam has been at, I don't know if Western has a disability studies program, Pam, but
King's College does, an affiliate college.
You know, so these programs, while they provide a lot of support and curriculum to their students, often they partner with community organizations. So here in the Dallas, Texas area, the UT Arlington, University of Texas at Arlington, does a lot of partnership with community groups of people with disabilities. So there are examples of this, but I think it's becoming more challenging in the kind of environment within which universities operate, where they can devote resources into these kinds of activities without getting some kind of external funding. So that's.
And I'd like to add that there are some tensions actually between when you're talking specifically about disability justice versus disability rights. And there are some generational differences. There's some differences of community members, like as we discuss in the book, rights advocacy was often sort of dominated by white middle class parents. And a rights approach can exclude people who, you know, don't fall within that paradigm of who deserves certain rights. And a disability justice approach was developed by activists as a way to address this sort of gap, this inability of a rights discourse to truly engage in an intersectional way in, you know, social injustice realities. In terms of the engagement of disability justice with academia, one of the tensions is of to signal boost the people who developed these concepts, the activists who developed these concepts, and not appropriating them. Which is something that academia can do very comfortably, and you know, we've seen this happen. So I feel like the role of institutions and scholars within institutions is to make sure that concepts and improve, you know, like intellectual property or intellectual engagements and constructions that are really important to an activist approach are credited to the activists and the groups of activists that developed them, and then working in alliance and working in a way to amplify the activists. And it's one of the things that I think disability studies has the potential to do, is that for us, critical theory comes from the grassroots. It doesn't come from the ivory tower. So you know, so this is a really important approach. I see a question from Michelle Friedner. How do we define activism?
Well, I think activism can take many different forms. In some cases, activism is doing what you can to make sure that your kid gets what you think he or she deserves. So activism can be simply going out and making sure that the places that your child wants to go are accessible, or that the services that your child wants are made available to them. So that's a form of activism. I don't think we are defining it in a very narrow way, but rather in a very broad way in the book. To some extent, organizations are activists when they are trying to change public policies or to make other larger adjustments in the overall community. So you could even count activism in terms of focused on, say, popular culture. That may not always take directions that some disability activists would agree with, but by changing how we perceive various kinds of impairments, that can be a form of activism as well. So, you know, in a way that a lot of activists might not like, we could consider Jerry Lewis telethons to be a form of activism. So activism
or eugenics.
We could consider eugenics a form of activism. Sure. I mean, you can be, it simply means that you're being active in pursuit of a particular goal. So we're not trying to have a more restrictive view of activism.
Because it really has changed so much across time, across different social movements. You know, there isn't really, I think, a single way to define it.
I think that leads right into this question. You've touched on it, but maybe you want to go into it further. What tactical differences exist between activism, direct action by disabled leaders, and advocacy by parents? What can we learn from those differences?
Well, and Richard, before you answer that, Susan, did we lose our captioning?
No, you just have to go to the bottom and click on closed captioning. When you click on that, you can click on show subtitles.
Okay.
It'll show the captioning.
So somebody had asked about it in chat, so let us know if you're having trouble with. It says captioning cut off for me as well.
Yeah,
I
I'm not
have
seeing captioning.
subtitles, but I'm not.
Oh, it's back. It's back, I think. Or maybe that's just the chat. Maybe I'm just seeing the chat.
Right. I at least am not getting subtitles. I was, and I'm not any longer.
You see the little box with the CC at the bottom? When you go down to the bottom of your screen, there are these options here. There's CC, closed caption. If you click on that and click on show subtitles, you'll get the closed captioning.
Okay, and you're seeing yours right now?
Because I'm not seeing it.
I'm not seeing mine. Mine is on, but I'm not seeing it, is what
Yeah,
I'm
me
saying.
too.
Yeah.
I clicked show and don't see.
Perhaps we can work on that, and I'll just take a quick response to the question while
Go for it.
Okay.
and Zoom, more than me, can try to figure out the technology. But I guess, and we haven't done a thorough study of this, but I think activists with disabilities are far more likely to engage in the kinds of direct action of protests and putting themselves on the line in that way than parent groups have. There have been examples of parents who've done that, but by and large, parents, those have not been the strategies that parent organizations or even individual parents have taken, although there are, of course, exceptions. Whereas groups like ADAPT or other disability activist organizations comprised of people with disabilities, not all of them are engaging in direct action, but there's a much greater likelihood, I'd say. So let me, either we can go back to talking about how the captions can be turned on, or there may be other comments.
Well, I've got them turned on, but for some reason they're
If
not.
I could just enter the equation here, because I'm having
David had his,
difficulty with my Zoom. Can you folks hear me?
Hello, thank you.
yes.
I'd like to tell you
Okay,
about what
I'm
activism.
having difficulty with.
Somebody else speaking? I'll pause.
Go ahead, David.
Okay, I'd like to share a little bit of the activism I've been trying to do for the last 2 months, self-activism. I'm qualifying for Medicare. I've got 2 months ago, I got a letter that says that they're going to take money out of the only money I get each month, with is Social Security, to pay for Part B. And for the last 2 months, I have been trying to find out, calling Medicare. They're telling me that I have to fill out certain applications through the state in order to get the premium paid and the co-pays paid, you know, by filling. Medicaid is supposed to pay this difference. And so because of the COVID-19, I can't get through to the phones of Medicaid. I can't deal with the case manager that's been assigned to me through the state, Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And so I have gotten through to somebody at DHS that has told me that they'll make sure that I get these applications sent to me in the mail. It's going to come in July. So I just today, got the notice from the Social Security Administration saying that, number one, I can't get these applications. What the DHS sent to me instead of the applications I've been waiting for the last 3 weeks is they sent me a booklet telling me all the things that I need to do, which is something that I got from Medicare. So they sent me the wrong thing. their phone, I can't get through on their phone lines, and the Social Security Administration has now just sent me this letter saying that they are going to be taking the Social Security to pay for September's premium out of my next check, which is coming up in September. And they can't, I was told in July that they can't even see the my Medicare in their database, in their system, until August. So this is giving me no time whatsoever. There seems to be nothing I can do, even though I've tried for the last 2 months to set this thing up in my own advocacy to deal with this situation where the state is actually, and Susan's seen me bring this up before, the state is the one that's getting in the way. I yield. Thank you.
Yeah, I think often the state constructs bureaucracies that are super hard to navigate. And I think it's a purposeful strategy, right? To make it so that, right, they know that Medicaid, they know that Social Security, these are services for people with disabilities, yet just getting through the phone system, right? I've had to help people just get to a person and to stay on the line for ages, right? And this does suck away time. It sucks away energy, and it hinders people from fighting for bigger things because you're fighting for the basic resources for your survival, right? And so, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have any easy answer for you for your particular situation, but you know, but I think it is a real struggle that families and people with disabilities deal with all the time, is just this basic work for things that are supposed to be rights, right? You're supposed to have a right to these services and supports, but there's so much work involved in getting them, and then dealing with bigger issues. It feels impossible.
Well, if I may, at what point does the line get drawn? Because I feel that it's intentional too. And in fact, I have requested over the last year and a half for a new case manager to be assigned to me. And I've gone all the way to the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, and been physically up to her building to let her know that I have what amounts to criminal allegations of intent. As you mentioned, you know, this is intentional. At what point does the line cross between just being a little mistake in a civil rights matter, which attorneys need to take care of in a so-called civil court, and at what point does criminal allegations do they have validity against these state people who are doing what amounts to racketeering and domestic terrorism when they're stepping on our rights like this? I yield again. Thank you.
Taking off. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
I mean, I think really that's a question for a lawyer, but I think that Social Security, Medicaid, these big bureaucracies count on weeding people out who don't have the resources to hire lawyers, who don't have the resources to keep coming back. And so they're well prepared, right? They are expecting people to hire lawyers to pursue their cases because, right, then you'll get your services and they'll give you your back pay. But they've weeded out all those people who don't have the energy and the resources to hire a lawyer. Well, so I don't actually know where the line is, but expecting people to hire lawyers is part of the strategy, I think.
Well, I don't think we can solve your problem, David.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
And we're way over time.
Right there is the difference
Okay,
between
I
a
think
rights, the exclusion of a rights-based approach, you know,
Right.
and the reality of the injustice of the situation that is not, you know, that it's almost impossible to deal with.
Yeah.
But it does lead to another question that someone has asked, and that's, you mentioned that early parent advocacy groups came from more privileged populations. In contemporary times, are you seeing a shift in parenting advocacy to having more diversity in their membership and directed towards embracing intersectionality or engage with other anti-oppression struggles?
You want me
I
to?
can't hear you.
We haven't studied that directly, but I would expect there are. I think, I know just in some local examples, some of our Black Lives Matter activists are also speaking out on disability issues. I think that the kinds of intersectionalities people are more aware about them. I think a lot of feminists are speaking out on behalf of disability issues. So I don't think, as a blanket, it would be hard to actually measure that nationally or even in many communities. But certainly in the 40s and 50s, a lot of the early groups were people who had fairly affluent circumstances, who by and large were white, or by and large used some of their family or business or whatever connections, community connections, to try to draw on resources. But I think as with social media and with a lot of changes in communication technology, and really a broadening of activism. I was talking before about how activism could be a lot of different kinds of things. But a lot of people are engaged in activism, and a lot of diverse people are engaged in activism. To some extent, when you develop a toolkit of being an activist, you can apply that to other issues in your life. So I would expect the answer would be yes. But let me pass this over to others.
I see that Tamara.
Can I ask a question?
I think there's someone with their hand up, but maybe after Tamara you could talk. You could
Okay,
ask.
sure.
Tamara, are you still there?
Yes, sorry. I have watched a narcolepsy network, which is a medical disability based on an autoimmune disorder that started out as grassroots individuals with disability coming together to connect patients with doctors directly so that they can get the information and also share experience. But eventually that group was taken over by parents as younger and younger individuals with that disability were identified. And then the doctors that were, or the individuals who were hired to be spokespeople, the professionals, working with the parents and using disability discrimination in order to push out the individuals with disabilities. Do you see that happening often in with other disability groups, or is this a unique case? Do I need to rephrase?
I don't know that we have the data to see any larger patterns, but I think to some extent, if people have political resources, they're better able to use those on behalf of their children. And so groups that have access to resources, whether it's financial resources, whether it's political resources, whether it's other kinds of social networks, they are better able to become activists. And to the extent that people are socially isolated, they are less likely to become activists. So I don't know if
I think that's an interesting example, Tamara. I feel like I've seen the opposite. I've seen like diagnoses controlled by parents and professionals, and then, you know, disabled advocates, especially with childhood disability, as the children then grow up and, you know, take their own stances, and as groups, you know, communally engage. But I haven't, but I think that's a really interesting case that you have, but I haven't seen, I don't think I've seen other examples of that.
Interesting.
happening.
I might want to talk to you
Yeah.
later about it, because it was interesting to watch as the different isms kind of came together and changed the organization over decades.
Yeah, and I've actually seen the opposite.
That is really interesting.
Yes.
Nora, did you have a question?
I don't know if this is an appropriate venue, but I know initially a few people said that they were siblings of disabled individuals. And one of the big challenges I have as an older, I had Mikey when I was 43 and he's 31. So I think a lot about the future. Just lost my husband to COVID-19. And I thank you. I just, I think about the future a lot of my disabled son. And as siblings, I have another, he has a sibling, he has one sibling. And I put Mikey into a group home because of his sibling. His sibling is, you know, went to Harvard College, works in finance, doesn't have time to take care of Mikey. I don't know if you folks know about New York finance, but they work about 90 hours a week. And so I put Mikey in a group home, and it's been one of the biggest challenges emotionally that I've had. And I just wanted to, again, I don't know if this is an appropriate venue. It's sort of gearing towards more sociological movements, but again, initially people said that they were siblings, and I did the group home because there's no one to take care of my son, you know, my disabled son, with the one sibling. I don't think it's fair or appropriate to put that on him. So I just wanted to, I mean, I guess the future of our children is so prominent, whether you're an older parent or a younger parent. Things happen to parents, unfortunately, and disabled children are very vulnerable. So I just thought perhaps I'd open it up to comments from those in this group that are siblings, if they so desire to give me feedback on that. Thank you.
I would like to talk about that, but I want to, I'm going to have to say this is going to have to be my last question that I can answer, because I really need to go now. I'm sorry.
Who's speaking now? Who's speaking?
This is Pamela Block. I'm one of the co-authors.
Yep.
My parents passed away in 2014 and 2013. And so I became the sibling that was geographically closest to my sister. We were, she was in Rhode Island when I was in New York. Now I'm in London, Ontario. I'm still the closest sibling to her. It's rough, actually. I mean, but I look on the kinds of supports that my mom made sure were in place. And I also look at the supports that she didn't put in place and how they have affected Hope's quality of life in positive and in not so positive ways. But I do think that we adapt. I mean, when my parents were gone, there's three of us, and my other sister and I, you know, do the best we can to collaborate with the service providers that are the daily part of my sister's life. And we do what we can to follow what we think my mom would have wanted. I mean, you know,
right.
like you know, I mean, not 100%, because one of the very first things that happened after my mom passed away is that Hope made major changes in her life. And she's like, Mom wanted these things for me, but I never wanted them for myself. But, so, you know, I'll put a, you know, I'll say in some things, you know, but in major things like philosophies of housing and community-based versus, you know, like living with a roommate instead of in a group home, for example. You know, and those kinds of conceptual, you know, we weren't always able to do exactly what I know was my mom's vision. But we do the best we can. And my sister is always reminding me that I'm not her guardian, and she's not always in agreement with my perspective, and I have to accept that, right? And so, and she wasn't always in agreement with mom, although I think she was less willing to fight mom than she feels very comfortable disagreeing with me. But I'm going to see if anybody else has anything they want to say. The world didn't end. You know, that's the one thing I just want to emphasize. And there are lots of things that you can do to ensure some kinds of structural continuity. And I understand that some of that is based on resources, or, you know, either personal resources, and there's a disparity there, and there's injustices there. Like, some people have access to more resources to protect their kids. But there's also structural supports available by the you know, federally and by the states that that can be put in place that do help.
I have a little comment. I don't think you need to worry about your mother's vision. I think your sister's vision might be better since she has to live the life.
Totally.
I hope you love that comment.
But it sounds like you're doing the best you can, you know, keeping track of the people who are working with her. That's really a key thing. I don't know
But
how you feel
also-
about it, Susan, but that's my thought.
Oh, I know she's doing a great job, because I've been told, and I know she's happy and doing fine.
Thank you, Pamela.
I think we are
Thank
pretty
you.
much done with the
Can I just say one thing to Eleanor?
Yes.
I as a case manager.
Who's speaking now?
Sorry,
Who's-
this is Tamara Bigel. As a case manager, as a former case manager of someone at a group home, I would highly recommend. I can see your pain, and that you want to make sure that you advocate for your son even when you're not there. I would highly recommend writing up a letter to his future case managers with your vision, you know, with some of your visions, your wants and desires for him.
Right.
That's one way you can kind of put your input, but I strongly encourage you, before you write this and while you're writing it, to also communicate with your son, is it, who's in the group home?
Yes, yes.
To make sure that that's also his vision.
Yeah, I know what he wants. I know what he wants, yeah. But thank you, Tamara, yeah. It's, I don't know if the meeting's ending soon, but I'll just put my 2 cents in. I think that being a parent of a disabled child is such a difficult journey, so difficult, so challenging.
It is. I mean, and it is a lifelong, and you even need to worry about after you pass away, and that's
Yes.
something that
Yes.
is really common for parents
Yes.
to really be worried about what happens
I worry
afterwards.
about it every day, every day.
And
at
there
the same
are
time,
supports, but we also know you can't completely trust the state, right? We know that, and so
And the group home, you cannot, that's the problem, the group home.
and things
Even good
change.
group homes. My son is in a good group home, but it ain't great. It just ain't great.
yeah.
And that's the truth. That's the truth.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the work that you do.
I'm sorry?
Thank you for all the work you do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for saying that.
I think we have one final question, and then we'll let everybody go. And that's, what led you guys to write this book? Was there a particular experience that led you to write the book? Something that you guys shared, or was it individual?
Well, I think so. Pam and I are both siblings, and so I feel like we live a little bit between these two worlds of
Right.
people with disabilities and parents, and trying to
Right.
navigate between those worlds. So that idea of whether we're in alliance or tension, I think, is really relevant. more practically, Richard and I chatted at a conference one time about our interest in parent activism, and he suggested it, and we brought Pam into the fold.
It was right after my mom passed away, and I thought, well, what an amazing way to honor her, because she had a very specific vision as a parent who always explicitly allied herself with disabled activists. And I wanted to honor that.
All of us have been involved with the Society for Disability Studies for many years.
All of us have been leaders in that society, yeah.
Founders of that is a woman named Barbara Altman, a good friend of ours. She was once confronted, she has a son who has a mental disability, who lives in a group home. He's now a middle-aged adult. Was confronted disability activists who said, "You're not a member of our movement." And that's was a trigger for me to get interested in this question. So I think parents are a member of the movement, even though they are sometimes obstacles to the movement.
Yeah.
But we have known each other, the three of us, a long time, and we talk about all kinds of things. And this kind of came up, and we decided to pursue it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for including me.
Susan,
including
please
us.
send me an email.